Hey all, it's Dominique here with you. You're not going to get to see my mug today. You're going to actually get to see some beautiful orchids. We are going to continue broadening our topics on the show and on this YouTube channel. Welcome to My World with Dom and Dominique Does Life. And we're going to obviously continue the psychology and business coaching and psychotherapy discussions and the discussions about how to avoid toxic personality types. But we're going to talk about some other things too. One of the things that I have had highly requested of me as far as what kind of a video people would like me to make is an orchid growing video. And I have had people request that I do orchid growing classes and orchid growing primers. And, you know, if you are interested in that, please leave a comment in this comment section below, and I will happily do a local orchid growing class for those of you in Chicagoland, as well as a seminar on YouTube. Okay. Excuse me, please forgive the allergies today. They're quite bad. I'm trying my best not to clear my throat on you guys and cough at you too much in this video. So what you're going to notice, first and foremost, let's just start out saying that you know kitty cats really well, but you don't know orchids. You don't know a lot about growing orchids. So I'm going to start there, assuming that some of you don't have that information. And that's okay. I didn't when I started out either. Now, keep in mind that putting your nail polish next to your orchids is not a necessity. That is something that I've done purely because I have run out of space on the table next to my chair. So what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that unlike what most people do, unlike where most people put their orchids, these orchids here, these lovely phalaenopses, are in a window. Now, I don't want to hear from orchid growers that it's horrible to put them in a window. Relax, okay? Relax. If you're a seasoned orchid grower, this is one of those somewhat rare north-facing windows with a covered veranda outside, and these orchids love growing in this window. In fact, these two orchids out here, these phalaenopses out here, were getting ready to die on me. Threw them right outside on the covered veranda where they're not exposed to the elements too much, and they love it. As you can see, the leaves are springing back. The one phalaenopsis here with the orchid pests is absolutely looking wonderful. The pests are gone, and unfortunately at my old home there were orchid pests. So the pests are gone, the leaves are starting to grow back, and look how wonderful those leaves are starting to look. So let's first talk about what orchids are. No matter if you're growing a Cattleya orchid, a Phalaenopsis orchid, no matter really what kind of orchid you're growing, and I'm not going to throw too many terms at you right now, but no matter what kind of an orchid you're growing, orchids like to grow in potting medium. Okay? They like to grow in potting medium. Now, I'm not going to pull the inside pots out because I don't want to traumatize these plants, but you're going to be working with, usually they'll come in a plastic pot. If that pot does not keep the roots root bound enough and tight enough around the roots, then I think you need to try transferring it to a different pot that does. And you need to make sure that the plastic pot that the orchids come in has little holes in the pot itself, because orchid roots need a lot of air. If they don't get air, they will unfortunately start to decay and die. Orchids are essentially organisms which are somewhat parasitic in nature. They grow in the jungle, they grow off of trees and other plant life. So yes, orchids are parasitic organisms to an extent. So just sticking them in dirt and hoping for the best is not going to work. You never want to put an orchid in dirt, okay? As you can see, there are some differences between this orchid here and this orchid here. You don't want to try repotting an orchid that is in full bloom, because energy is needed for the flowers, for the stem, and for the base and the leaves. You want to repot orchids when they're not in bloom. I did have to repot this one when it was in bloom, however, because I noticed that the potting medium that I bought the orchid in was starting to become very broken down. It was starting to become moldy, and it was starting to smell, and that is one surefire way to kill your orchid. So I kind of took a chance that sure, the orchid might be in shock if I transferred it, but that it definitely wouldn't for sure die like it would if I left it in the moldy medium. So let's start there. Like I said, orchids like to be root bound. They like to be bound very tightly in the pot that you're growing them in. So they definitely like to be root bound. Now you don't want to be breaking off the air roots, but they like to be root bound. If you can see, I've just watered this one, so don't feel like my air roots are moldy. I literally just watered them. If you can see here and here, orchids have air roots. They have air roots. That means the roots grow up and out of the pot. And as I said, because they're somewhat parasitic in nature, they attach themselves to trees and other plants out in the jungle and out in the world. So that's why you're going to see these weird thingies sticking up out of the plant. It's not that you need to trim them back; just let them be. They're air roots. So let's talk about what an orchid is. It is a plant that grows a stem in fairly short order. It blooms once a year. So if your orchid doesn't bloom again very quickly, don't worry that it's dead. Don't worry that it's dead. And as you can see, when the orchid blooms, it gets flowers equally on either side of the stem. One flower, another, so on and so forth. So they grow equally on either side of the stem. I think there's some real mathematical beauty in that, as well as just visual beauty. It's pretty darn cool. Now, if you're lucky, some orchids are going to have 2 stems with flowers on each one, which is really, really fun and beautiful to look at. And apparently we've got some naughty kitties here somewhere in my house making noise. I apologize for that. Cats will be cats, right? So as you can see, these blooms are starting to die out. These orchids have been blooming for months on end. They've had a very, very long life cycle. And so what we're going to do when the blooms die back is unless we're looking to salvage a possible keiki, or basically the beginnings of another orchid plant, in which case you would leave the stem totally intact. But if you're not trying to do that, and you're just trying to make sure that the plant's life cycle is restorative and that it has the energy it needs in its roots and its leaves, then when the bloom cycle is over, you're going to take a sterilized set of pruning shears or scissors that are very, very sharp. You don't want to take dull scissors. So you're going to sterilize them, and then you're going to cut down to I'm trying to give you a good visual here without traumatizing the plant. But you're going to cut at about the second, see these little notches here? You're going to cut at about the second notch from the base of the plant. You're going to cut right over that second notch. Some people say right below the second notch. I suppose that either is fine, but right around that second notch. And what you're going to do is, after you've cut that area, you're going to take some cinnamon, or you're going to take an alcohol and water solution, or a very, very light peroxide and water solution, and you're going to very carefully apply it to the tip of the stem that's been cut. And you're going to make sure that the orchid doesn't get infected as things are cut back and as it begins to conserve its energy for next year's bloom cycle. Okay, And what you're going to look for, either when the plant is blooming or when it is conserving energy, is you're going to look for, again, this, we talked about why this plant is not in as good of shape as it was previously. So this is basically a good representation of what your leaves should not look like. Basically, I mean, they're not folding or coming apart. They don't have rot in them or anything, but they should stand up a little straighter. They shouldn't be floppy. They should be kind of crisp. The color is good. The color is good in these particular leaves, but you're gonna see, if you notice that the leaf kind of moves around at the base, it's possible that water has gotten in there, and you're gonna want to go in with a tissue or with some paper towel and just dry off the crown and this area on the orchid. You're going to want to make sure that water does not get in this area at all. It's very important, because then you'll have crown rot or root rot. So you're going to want to look for healthy leaves that are almost plasticky feeling, really kind of tough. They're sticking up straight. That's what you're going to want to look for in your orchids. Now, if they're flopping a little bit, it could be that, like I said, that there's some water in the crown area. You need to carefully dry that area off. It could be that the plant is not root bound enough, which could be the case with this orchid, to be honest. I may have to think about putting it in a smaller pot, because like I said, they like to be root bound. And you've got to make sure that the color of the leaves looks good. If they're really, really, really light green, then it's possible, or too dark green, it's possible that they're either not getting enough light or that they're getting too much light. So they should be about this color green. And like I said, don't worry if they're starting to flop a little bit, as long as they don't look diseased, as long as they don't look rotten, as long as they're not being eaten through by a pest, that's fine. What you are going to want to do, excuse me, is every once in a while carefully take a damp cloth and clean off the leaf, and make sure to keep them clean and shiny, and you'll be doing your part to help the plant stay healthy. Like I said, when you're watering, don't ever overwater, first of all, and don't water it too often. You've got to make sure and check the roots, check the media, see what it is. If it's still got moisture in it, you want to wait a couple of days till it dries out to water it. And you've got to make sure that you don't get it on the crown at all. No water on the crown. So if your crown is way too close to the potting media, the potting medium, then it's possible that you're going to get some rot, some wetness. So again, being mindful of that is very important. Let's talk really, really briefly about cutting off air roots. If you notice that some of your air roots are looking really, really withered and they just don't need water, like if they're looking moldy, if they're, I don't have any really bad ones now that I need to cut off, but if they're looking, like this one could go either way in the future. Like if they're looking a little gnarly, if they're looking brown, if they're looking like they've got notches in them, or like they're falling apart because they're too wet, and they're kind of coming apart, then it's time to cut that air root off. If you've got a healthy portion up here, for instance, and a really gross portion down there, and there's like a little notch, you can always cut it at the notch. Make sure to sterilize, as we talked about. But I recommend cutting it all the way up, any air roots that need to come off, all the way up at the crown, and close to the base of the plant. Now you don't want to actually cut into the crown itself. You just want to cut off the roots that aren't doing you any good and that are maybe affecting the growth and bloom cycles of the plant. So what you're going to want to do is just keep an eye on that. Check it a couple of times a week, even every day if you can. You don't need to be super obsessive about it, but keep an eye out, because orchid problems can develop quickly, and once they develop, sometimes it's kind of hard to rescue the orchid. But orchids aren't difficult to grow once you know what to look for and what to do. So what you're going to really want to keep an eye on, like I said, is the elasticity, or hopefully lack thereof, with the leaves. You want them to be standing up straight, looking crisp. You want them to be just the right color of green, not too light, not too dark. If they're getting way too much light, you maybe need to move them away from the window, put them in the shade. That's why I've chosen to keep these orchids out here in the shade on my veranda. If it becomes way too hot or gets under about 65, 70 degrees, you're going to want to bring them in. And you don't want to just habitually leave them outside. I think I have kind of a different set of circumstances at my place than most people do. Most people don't have a north-facing wall of windows where they have a covered porch or a covered area that shades the amount of light that the orchids are getting, that reduces the amount of light, right? So don't ever put them in a south-facing window. Don't just leave them out on your deck in the sun. Don't put them in an east or even a west-facing window. Be very judicious with the amount of light they're getting. I like to get stands like this for my orchids. You can move them around. Sometimes I'll move it over into this corner here, and other times I will just put it right here in the window. I think that that's a good way to be able to make sure that all of your orchids are set up to get the same amount of light. I did have a couple of plants that died recently. I have tried to go full water culture with a couple of my plants and transition them carefully, which basically means no potting medium, and that just didn't work for the two plants I tried it with. It's been successful in the past, but if your orchids are healthy and you don't feel like you need to change up the method that you're using to grow them, don't. So there are different ways to grow them. Like I mentioned, you can put them in media. You can put them in water. You can leave them dry for part of the week and start introducing them to water for another part of the week, and then slowly kind of move them over to full water culture where they're just simply growing in water all the time. Of course, you're never going to want the crown to be submerged, and the leaves don't need to be wet for any reason. What you're going to want to do is make sure that your orchids are liking whatever you're doing with them. Pay attention to the feedback they're giving you. Pay attention to that feedback. The feedback I'm getting from this one is that it really likes where it's at, and it's feeling pretty good about its pot. It's feeling pretty good about the amount of light it's getting, the amount of water it's getting. So I just want to touch quickly on a couple of sort of myths about orchids. There are many folks out there who have visited orchid hothouses and seen them being misted, and they think, oh, great idea, I'll mist my orchids. I want to caution you on that. Like I said, just clean the leaves gently and carefully with a wet cloth, not drenched, just a damp cloth, in fact, and don't expose that crown to water, really. That's very important. You do not want to expose the crown area of the plant to water. You really don't. So misting is not necessary. It's not something you need to do, unless you're, of course, just misting the air roots, which they absolutely love. But misting the entire plant is a no-go if you're growing orchids at home. As you can see, there was some sort of an incident or issue, or maybe an orchid pest problem where I bought this one at a store, and you want to be careful about things like that, like overwatering and pests from store-bought orchids. You want to go to somewhere like Orchids by Hauserman here in the Chicago area. Go to an orchid hothouse if you can to get your orchids. It's definitely not impossible to nurse store-bought ones back to life, but the fact is that when they're coming into a store, they're coming in and they're being tended to by people who don't know how to care for orchids. Problems can ensue. Now, Okay, we've covered watering, potting, how the orchid grows, what it should look like. I'm trying to think of what else you folks might want to know about orchids and orchid growing. Oh, even if an orchid looks almost completely dead, the cool thing about orchids is you can almost always find a way to save it. So don't throw out that quote unquote dead orchid. You may just need to clean off the leaves, put it in either, if it's just got only a couple of air roots and it is looking like it's about to go on to the other side and take that stairway to heaven, you can easily just kind of spray the roots, and you don't have to pot it immediately unless you have a tiny little pot, like I said, that's slotted or that you can kind of cut holes into. So you can easily save it by just spraying the roots, giving them some air, leaving them out, giving the plant some sunlight, not too much, giving it a good temperature. My experience has been that orchids like to grow in temperatures between 70 and even 90 or so degrees, because they really are a tropical plant. So you don't need to spray the flowers for any reason with water. And if you're going to use fertilizer, make sure that it's got a different nitrogen count than, or nitrogen level rather, than other fertilizers. This count is not great. You need something a little bit lower than this. I mean, it works, but be sparing. And you don't need to use the food every time you feed, or rather every time you water the plant. Be sparing. Maybe once every couple of weeks, once a month, and dilute it quite a bit. I think that will probably do it for today. If you have any questions about orchid growing, please feel free to let me know in the comments section. And let me know if there are any great tips that you have that you'd like to share. Now, I do want to mention one more quick thing as we're about to wrap up here. There is this sort of like urban legend out there that regarding orchid growing, that you should set an ice cube in with the roots and that will slowly water your plant. I mean, it's possible that won't kill your plant and that your plant is just really hardy, but that's not a good idea. Again, these are tropical plants. They're not used to having ice on their roots. I think about if you were standing around with ice around your feet, you'd get frostbite. Your feet would probably have to be amputated eventually if you were living in ice all the time, and you would eventually die or get an infection. So you don't want to do that to your orchid. And even watering it with cold water is not a great idea. So the orchids with ice is just not the ticket. So definitely stray away from that particular way of trying to grow your orchids for the health of your orchid. I've definitely met several people who have said, well, I'm doing the ice for my orchids and they're dying and I don't know why. It's like, well, I do. You're putting ice on their roots and basically slowly killing them. You don't want to do that. They're a tropical plant. So, pretty easy, simple way to stop your orchids from taking that stairway to heaven if you are concerned that they are dying. And if you're using ice, don't do it. Use just lukewarm water. Don't drench the plant. There are people that drench and soak the orchids, but you really have to be careful that you're watching it so carefully and that you are using a very slotted tub and that there's lots of air coming in if you do that. And I wouldn't recommend that. You're beginning to just start out and see what you think about orchid growing. You don't need to get involved with sort of more time-consuming and risky techniques like that. So I hope this helps. And like I said, if the orchids don't immediately bloom back right away after you cut them down, don't think, oh my gosh, they're dead, what am I going to do? Just remember that orchids bloom about once a year. Sometimes you'll get another bloom cycle out of them, and you really don't need to worry that they're dead or expect another bloom from them. We'll talk about what keikis are and how to generate another plant from an orchid plant in the future. Right now we're going to keep it simple. So thanks for tuning in, folks, and good luck with your orchid growing. Again, let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if you have any good tips or tricks that work for you. And you have a wonderful day.